Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlie Barker. I'm the president of the Penfield Heritage Association. I'm glad that all you people are here. We've got a full house. Our speaker today is Donovan Shilling. He's going to do a talk on the millers and the mills around Penfield. I came to one of his talks a little while ago on the mills around the Rochester area, and it was very interesting. And maybe at some point he'll redo that, and you can join him for that. He's also has several other programs he's doing throughout the springtime here in Penfield. So, Donovan, I'm going to leave it for you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
He just got out of the hospital this morning. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I will try to be as brief as possible because the longer I talk, the harder the seats get. As you know. We're going to be talking about three different major individuals who are part of Rochester's milling, or Penfield's milling history. One, of course, is Daniel Penfield. Another one that you're probably familiar with is Samuel Rich. And the third one, who may not be quite as well known to you, is a gentleman whose name was Lincoln. Not Abraham. Andrew. It was Andrew Lincoln, yes. And so we'll be talking about those three particular people more than anybody else that was in the Rochester, or in the Penfield area. We'll begin by talking a little bit about milling itself. That's why you have those handouts. The process of milling was no easy chore. One had to find a good fall of water or a good consistent wind, if you have a windmill or a water wheel. And in America, it was not windmills, it was water wheels. Of all the kinds of water wheels they tried, the one that worked the best was called the overshot wheel, where the water came over the top of the wheel. And you always had to have a good body of water consistently throughout every season of the year. And so that meant that many times you'd have to form a mill pond. And forming a mill pond was no easy task either, because you had to build a dam. And that was a problem in building a dam, but they were able to do that. Sometimes it wasn't quite necessary to build a dam, but most of the time it was so that in the summertime, when things began to dry up, you'd always have a steady current of water. Now, the important thing about milling is that you've got to build the mill next. Now you found a place, and what you do, of course, is to go in, and the first thing you want to do is to put in a water wheel, if you can, so that you can put in a sawmill, so that you can saw up all the woods or trees around you, so that you can help build your mill, which is very, very helpful. And you also need somebody who is a good mason, because you need a good foundation for the mill. And thinking about being inside of a mill is something very, very different than you might expect. If you were to go into the mill in the 1880s or 1840s or whatever, you would probably have to put on earmuffs, because it was very, very noisy. The whole building would hear the rumble of that big stone wheels, one against the other. You'd hear the slap and grind sometimes of these belts that they used. You'd hear the creaking of the rafters as the whole building kind of shook. And then you'd be absolutely amazed at the color inside. It would be just like a snowstorm. Everything would be white, because once you ground that flour, it was no stopping it, because it would be about the same consistency as face powder, and it would blow all over. So you'd see the millers with their mantle of white. The sides of the buildings would be all white. The walls would be white. There'd be white on all the machinery. Everything would be covered with white. It was quite an interesting thing. And, dramatic pause, and the air would be filled with this fine dust powder. And one spark, and you could have lost your mill. So for that reason, they never had a fire in the mill. The mill was never heated. You always had a little pot-bellied stove and a place next to it, maybe the office, but it was not connected, so that there'd be no danger of fire in the mill. Except every one of these mills either burned or was lost by flood, believe it or not. And it happened over and over again. So that's why we only have one mill left today, and of course that's the Daisy Flour Mill, and we're going to be talking about that at the end of the program. Well, let's talk about Daniel Penfield. Now, I have no idea where he got all of his money. But Daniel Penfield had money. He lived at one time on Manhattan Island. Now, whether it was the Upper West Side or not, I don't know. But he lived in a 3-story brick building with his wife. And he had lots of money. He had married a young lady named Fellows. You've heard of Fellows Road? Okay. He'd married a Fellows, and they lived there happily. But just like Colonel Rochester, he wasn't happy there. He wanted to go out on the frontier. Where was the frontier? Right here in soggy Penfield. Well, it wasn't soggy. It was not soggy now, but it was soggy then. And I know that Colonel Rochester brought his whole family and his entourage up here to start milling. And believe it or not, somehow Daniel had to get his lovely wife to come to this godforsaken place. But not until, she said, until you build me a very nice house. And of course, you know that house still exists. It used to be called, it was painted his famous color. What was his favorite color? That's right, yellow. Remember the yellow rose? Well, you may not remember that, but it was the yellow rose, and it's still there today. I think it's hair thingy?
Hair salon.
Hair salon, yes, today. But that was the house that he built for his wife, got her up here. Now, there is a place in Penfield that was called the Hollow. And in that place, which is down off our linear park, towards the end of the section of Penfield Road that takes us up to Rochester, is where he built his first mill. Sawmill first, and then, of course, he built a regular mill. Now, if you open up your pages, please, to the first page, you can see a picture of one of the mills. And this particular one is a picture of the Lincoln Mill, which you go by every time you go over to East Rochester on Linden Avenue. And then, of course, there was his mill, and there is a picture of what his mill looks like in the very back, I think, yes, of your paper. And now, this is not the original mill. Why not? Because the original mill burned. The original mill was painted, what color? Yellow, right. And so they called it the old yellow mill. And then after it burned, then they painted it white, and then they called it the old white mill, right. So here's what it looks like. And of course, what you can see here is the mill pond that was a part of it. I think that's why we included it, so you could see what that looked like. It's not there anymore. It burned up. Probably if somebody were to take a walk on a trail, they might be able to find some of the foundation stones for some of these early mills. That's a distinct possibility, because she knows. She's been there and done that.
He knows.
Right. Is that right? Yes, okay. So about the only thing that exists now today are just some of these hand-hewn stones that made up the foundations for these marvelous mills. Now, the interesting thing about milling is the fact that you have to have millstones if you're an early colonial miller. And you can't use limestone, you can't use sandstone, you have to use granite. And I have no idea, maybe you can help me, how they got that hole through the middle of those two grindstones. It must have been a real job to do that. Some of the best millstones were called French stones that had come from Europe as ballast on ships. And they put them together to make millstones. The millstones around here, however, probably came from New England, and they were probably granite. The ones that were used by Daniel Penfield came from Albany, so they probably were shipped from Albany down here along with the mill irons. And a part of milling is that you have to have mill irons. Why? Well, you've got these two stones, and you look, one is called, that doesn't move, it's called the better, and the other one is called the runner. And you have to carve the stones with little channels or furrows so that when the wheat berry is dropped down on top of the stones, it will shear it off and make it so fine that it comes out as face powder. It's a marvelous thing to do, and how were able to do this we don't know, except that it took continual change of this large wheel on the top with these mill irons to lift it off and turn it upside down so that you can see the gentleman who's using a mill bill, that little hammer, to put the little furrows in so that it helps to sharpen the two stones. The nether stone, of course, doesn't move, and the one on the top does move. And then we have a problem. A mill wheel goes this way, but the grindstones go this way. So now we have a problem. How is that going to be arranged? There was no bevel gears around back then. Mr. Gleason hadn't come up with those. But they did figure out something called a lantern gear. Now, if you look at this page, right here, you'll see this special mechanism down here that transfers the power of the water wheel to the power of the millstones. And it's done by that particular gear. Now, they're all made out of wood. And so when the mill first started operation, you got all kinds of vibration until they were worn in. And those wooden parts all geared together. There was no metal in this. As you can see, it was all done with wood, except the metal that was used called mill irons to lift the stones up and back. Sometimes, in some cases, they couldn't get a whole solid 300 or 350 pound, 5 foot wide hunk of granite, and they used smaller pieces, French bursto they called it, and put that together and with a strap of iron around it. And that worked out fairly well. So now what we're doing is grinding up this grist or the flour, and it was a remarkable thing to have happen here right in Penfield, because now we have people farmers bringing in their wheat to be ground into flour. What do you do with the flour? Well, there happened to be a little community called Tryon, and Tryon was right on Arundecoit Creek that led to the bay. And it was not filled with silt the way it is today. It was fairly shallow, well, not shallow, fairly deep, so they could bring in bateaux, I like that new word, flat bottom boats. And they had a bunch of those, and Mr. Penfield and his buddies, they always took about 6 gentlemen to run a mill, at least 6, okay, would take them over to Tryon and put these barrels of flour on these flat bottom boats and send them up to Montreal. As a matter of fact, somewhere in my notes, and I can never find them when I want them, it tells about that. Yes. It says in 1806, Daniel Penfield built the first large sawmill in the Hollow, which we talked about, and also a grist mill. The irons and gearing were brought by team from Albany. Then in 1815, Daniel Case built a grist mill on the Arundecoit, which he ran for 35 years. Then they found something else out. Barrel of flour, a keg of whiskey. You can do 2 things with wheat. You can either make flour out of it, or you can make whiskey out of it. Gee, if we make the whiskey and sell the whiskey, it doesn't take up just much space, and you get more money for it. So there were about 5 or 6 distilleries in early Penfield as well, because they knew that you just didn't have to have bread; you had to have something to go with it. So that was one of the interesting things that they discovered, which was kind of neat. Now, a gentleman named Hip, you've heard of Hip Creek and so on, Hip House. He had a distillery. There were other people who had distilleries. Anybody who was along that 90-foot fall, if you go over to where we now call it Spring Lake, and then you go all down to the place called the Hollow, down at the bottom of the flats where the Panorama Plaza is, the drop is about 90 feet. And a 90-foot drop brings up a lot of water. It can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. It's a good thing when you're a miller, it's a bad thing when springtime comes. Because when springtime comes, we've had 2 of the worst floods ever. We have people selling their bushels of flour to Canada, particularly. And it was a lot of Canadian, what they found out is that the flour that came from those farmers who had farms along the Genesee had not just regular, ordinary, everyday flour, it was flour that was good for cakes and for cookies and for pastries. It was especially very good brand of flour. It became so popular that people over in England, in the courts of England and France, wanted their cakes made out of flour. Now, I think, was it Marie Antoinette? I think that she was going to eat that flour. Let me, right. Right, well, you'd have to know your history, right? Okay, well, at any rate, let's go on. So, Samuel Rich was another gentleman who came to this particular part of the world. He had walked to see his sister Cybra, all the way from Wells Fleet on Cape Cod. He got here, and he was amazed at this drop of water. He said, boy, I think I ought to invest in this. He got some money from his father and started his own milling business. Just let me trace you back a little bit. Remember I said that Daniel Penfield must have had some money. He bought 15,000 acres of land. He bought most of Northfield that encompasses both Webster and Penfield. He had 5,000 acres over in Wayne County and another 10,000 acres right here in Monroe County. Yeah, man, now figure it out. If it was a shilling, 25 cents an acre, that would be a lot of money, like what, $600 or something back then? It was a good investment, right? And if it wasn't for that, I don't know, because he really started things going. He had several different, he had a store. He got the ashes from all the farmers who were taking down their trees and bringing in the ashes from the burned trees. He had his own soap factory as a result of that. Of course, he had his distillery. He had his sawmill. And he had several mills. And he had a beautiful yellow house. And he had a wonderful daughter, Jane Penfield. And who do you think Jane Penfield married? Jane Penfield, this is a little aside, it's okay. Jane Penfield married Captain Francis Brown. Francis Brown, you may remember, is the person who started some place called Frankfurt and also dug this big channel called Brown's Race. And she married him. Good capture, wasn't it? And she turned down at least one or two suitors before she married him. Another name that comes up that I didn't include is the name of Livingston. James Kirk Livingston? No. James K. Livingston. I don't know if it's James Kirk Livingston. James K. Livingston. And he had a marvelous mill. He had spent $40,000 to build his mill. And if you take a look at your papers, and you got a pencil somewhere, it will show, yes, okay. You have that? Okay, on your paper, number 11, on the map. See the little map you have? Mm-hmm. Okay, number 11 is where Livingston had his mill. The interesting reason that I put that in there is that his dam had a dam 25 feet tall, high. So he had impounded a lot of water for his mill pond. It was really great. And of course, what happened? It burned. They rebuilt it. Guess what happened? It burned again. No luck at all. If you know something about Rochester's history, you know that the holy of holy places in the old 3rd Ward, Cornhill, was called Livingston Park. And this is the same Livingston that had that area. Livingston Park was the first gated community in Monroe County. As a matter of fact, it was closed on Sundays. You know, you couldn't get, all right. Well, that's just an aside. We're going to go through the whole thing and tell you where all these mills were located. As long as we're looking at the map, number 2 on the map that you have, and you can write this down, is of course where the first sawmill was. And number 5 is the second mill, grist mill. And number 7 is another one. All of these 3 mills at the top, or in the hollow, as it was called at the time, are part of Daniel Penfield's mills. Okay, over here is a big B. And that's where his house is today. That's where the home of Daniel Penfield is, on Penfield Road. That's the B. Okay. Now, we have to move along. What else do we know about him? That he was a wealthy man. He started a lot of things. He started an ashery. He started a distillery. He had a sawmill. There was a trip hammer mill. His son-in-law started a carding mill. Henry Fellows Road had a carding mill. There was a forge operated here, and it was powered by mill power. Paper mills, you've heard, we had a couple of Lawless Brothers paper mills eventually. And what happened to that? It burned. Right, they all burned. Okay.
Brickyard too.
And a brickyard. Right. Okay, and a soap factory. So let's turn along and move along a little bit and talk a little bit about Andrew Lincoln. You have a picture of Andrew Lincoln, and by the way, his home is, on your map, is 18, yes. And the one with the big A, that was the big mill pond, right here. That's just Spring Lake today, but it was the mill pond, and it was a marvelous place to go. This is what I found out from our 1876 directory of Monroe County. It says, Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln became parents of 3 sons and 3 daughters. Harriet, the wife of B.A. Baird. B.A. Baird of Salt Lake City, Utah. Huh? Bet you didn't know that. Right. Andrew W., Carlton U., and Josiah, all of whom became residents of Perrington. Sarah A., deceased, and Sarah A., who was the second of that name. So apparently, if you lost one daughter and another one came along, you might give her the same name as the one who passed away. Apparently that's what happened. Anyway, she became the wife of William Fellows of Penfield. What else did he do, Mr. Lincoln, besides building his mill? Well, he was the founder of the old Penfield Seminary. How about that? You probably didn't know we had a seminary in Penfield. Too bad we still don't have one. That would have been nice.
You know where it was?
No, it just says here. Pardon?
Somebody said, where was it? Fire hall. Fire hall.
Where the fire hall? Oh, okay. All right. We also had, by the way, a very interesting gentleman who used to live here. It's called O. Cedric Roundtree. Old Cedric Roundtree was the president of R.T. French. And that's in the big white house that's just down from the fire hall. I had to mention that. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about that pond that he built. We have, this was recorded some years ago. A young lady remembers this, and she says, the dam for the Lincoln Mill created a 50-acre spring lake that extended back to the New York Central Arch. Grace Raymond, great-granddaughter of Samuel Rich, describes Spring Lake as it was about 1900. She says this, I wish that you could have known the mill and the pond and it was what it was like when I was a child and a young girl. It was lovely in all the seasons. My father and his brothers had the ice boat there, but in my time it was used for ice skating and outing used ice to fill the numerous ice houses around. I wish I had the pictures of the pond with the bobsleighs being filled with ice and the men cutting and carrying it. And on the other part of the pond, the skaters having a joyful time. Now that was in the wintertime. Then she says, but to me, the pond was most attractive through the summer. Through the early autumn, it was lovely too, when you could row up to the banks and gather wild grapes. The season was officially opened in May. You could put your canoes in. Some of them put their canoes in the Erie Canal and came down that way and paddle into Bushnell's Basin and stay overnight. And then in the morning, they would put their canoes into the Arundecoit and start for the bay. By the time they arrived at the Lincoln Pond, they were tired enough to come up to our house where her father gave them milk, which was nice of him. Father usually hitched the team to the hay rack and went down and gathered the canoes and toted them around and below the sawmill, which simplified things for the canoeists. Sunday afternoons in the summertime, I sometimes went rowing with my mother, but it was the moonlight lit summer evenings that made the loveliest picture in my memory. Try to see it. Everywhere from 1 to 3 flat-bottomed rowboats full moon that beautifies any scene, everybody feeling gay. My cousin, Raymond Otis, always brought his cornet with him on these evenings, and someone else had a guitar, and Father was a good yodeler, and everybody sang. I think that the most thrilling to me of all that could have happened when I was a youngster was being tucked in a little corner and having a picture stamped indelibly in my mind of how beautiful it was on Spring Lake, or Lincoln Pond as it might have been called at the time. Okay.
Who's the author of that piece?
Her name was Grace Raymond. Okay.
Raymond Street, right?
Raymond. Right. Okay. So that is part of it. No. Yes, question.
Is Lincoln Pond on this map?
Yes. Well, it's called Spring Pond, and it's the A, I think, on there. Yeah, it's the one at the bottom. Okay. There's a big C on here. That house stands today on 5 Mile Line Road, and that's the house that belonged to Mr. Rich, Samuel Rich, his home up here. Still there today. You can see by the early stones that it's been there for a long time, but it's still in good shape. Okay, number 17 is one of the mills that was built by Mr. Lincoln. That's at 17. Okay, so you have most of those pretty well cited. Now we have up in front of here, and you'll look at it later on maybe, a three-dimensional outline of what the mills look like at the time and where they were located. But I don't know that you can get that many people up here at one time to see it, but that's okay. I think what I'd like to do now is to skip a little bit forward and tell you a little bit about Samuel Rich's mill, the one that he built at the bottom of Ellison Park. When you go down to Ellison Park, one of the first things he had to do was to get there. And to get down there was no simple thing. It was no Blossom Road. Enos Blossom hadn't built his road yet, nor the State Highway Department. Samuel Rich had to hack it out and build it on this curvy road coming down. Now, one of the things you've got to do today, maybe not today, some other time, is to go down Rich's Dugway. And you live on Duck, then you know you don't speed on Rich's Dugway. As a matter of fact, you have to be very careful going down. And to remember to hack that through the woods that was there and to keep it from dropping off into the glen was a job and a half. It's a marvelous place. There's deer that run in your people's backyards and everything else on there. It's a very wild and interesting place to live. Yeah. First thing he did was to saw up these beautiful, huge trees that were on that particular property where it's Ellison Park today. If you go into the mill itself, you'll find planks that are 24 inches wide. So wide that you can imagine how the girth of the tree, the trunk of the tree that those must have been sawed from. And if you look closely at them, you can see the marks of the big saws that made them. And also in the mill, you can see all of the marks of the saws and the axes when they built those timbers that help support the mill. It's an amazing place to be inside. Now the mill that's there today is much larger than the one that was there originally. It's been added on twice. And there's a small house. There's 3 houses on that site. The smallest one is the one that Samuel Rich built for his second wife. I think his first wife was named Case, and I don't remember his second wife's name. She didn't give it to me. Oh well. At any rate, the mill itself could probably start tomorrow, according to Mr. Heinrich, who was one of the owners of it. But we'll take you a step or two back into history. It was a thriving mill. It was an amazing place. When Riches immediately purchased the land just upstream from him by 1821, with the help of Andrew Lincoln, he constructed the historic Lincoln Mill. Additionally, he also built an imposing homestead still standing at 2204 5 Mile Line Road, which I've mentioned. Then his wife passed away in 1842. What did he do? He's leaving Penfield. He goes to Rochester. And what does he do in Rochester? Well, he was something of a carpenter, so he got a job building boats on the canal boats. And he did that for 4 years until 1846, when he decided that he was going to return to Penfield and move downstream near where the present mill site is located. Here he's got his second mill set up. It was completed in 1848. His second homestead was completed in 1850. Now, how do we know it's so old? Well, the plaster has horsehair that helps as a binder in some of the plaster of this old home over there that he built. That's how old it is. He built the mill that ran 24 hours a day, and it was essential then for those millers to live nearby. And of course, that's why he built the Rich's Dugway, to get people in and out, to get the flour down, get the barrels of flour out. One of the interesting things that maybe you've seen, is there anybody who hasn't been in there, in that mill, inside? We're talking about the Daisy Flour Mill. Okay. Well, once you go inside, it's not white anymore. All the white has been sandblasted off, except for one small area. And I must read about that. Oh. Well, here it is. If one entered the old wooden structure in 1885, when it was one of Penfield's 5 active mills, it would have been an awesome experience. First, one's ears would have been buffeted by the continuous rumble of the millstones, the vibration produced by the mill wheel, the slap and wobble of the power belts, and the creaking and groaning of the mills itself. It was through the mill, it was as though the mill was a thing alive, hungrily chewing up all of the grain that was offered to it, and moving it into fluffy white flour. Now, what about this place? There's one section that's all still white. And if one looks at it, there are dates put up there. And those dates represent the first snowfall of the season for the millers who worked there, because there was always the danger of a big storm maroon them, so to speak, down at the bottom, and not being able to get up Rich's Dugway. So that was the thing that's kind of neat. I think you have to go up on the second floor and look down and you can see it. The granaries that are there are made of 2x4s laid flat. And when you go inside the granaries, and there is a couple of tables in there where people could eat, you rub your hand down the walls, and the grain over the years it looks like a baby's bottom. It's so smooth from that friction of all the grain all those years. Now, what happened to it? Well, at first, of course, they were very happy. They had, we're going along with the water bringing all kinds of grinding mills and sending flour out and doing a wonderful job. And I can't tell you exactly how many hundreds of barrels of flour that went out of there. It was active, by the way, until 1972. Probably the oldest working mill in New York State up to that time that we know about. There might have been another one some other place, but at any rate, the mill itself was kind of an unusual place because it had a number of different kinds of wheels. They finally decided that they were going to put a turbine wheel in the basement. And a turbine wheel, the water would pass through. It didn't have to come over the mill wheel itself. It was just a different kind of organization. And then in 1934, or 34, no, 18, I'm sorry, we'll go back to 1865, when Rochester and Penfield had 5 or 6 days of below zero weather, and all the water froze up, and it broke the dam, and it destroyed part of the mill, and that's when they put in this turbine wheel, a metal turbine wheel in the basement. Eventually that cracked, and after that cracked, they put in a diesel, and it was a diesel engine that operated the mill right up until 1972. Now, on the cover of your magazine, or your handout, you have a picture of what the flour bag looked like. They call it the Daisy Flour Mill. That was kind of a generic name. Head Miller had the same outline, except they didn't have the Buddy S's on here. There was a Sperry whose name was Obadi, and so that they have the Buddy name, Buddy S for him up there in those two shields. Why they did that, I don't know, but it really personalizes it. Some of the last people to own it were the Sperry Gerard people who ran the mill, and somewhere I have a little article that was written by Andy Wolf. Remember Andy Wolf? Okay. Well, Andy had, here it is, had talked to those people. He talked to the people named Naramore. Naramore, a spare, quiet individual with a lively sense of humor and canny business sense, makes no claims of being an authority on milling business. He bought the company because he was looking around for a business to buy and heard that this one was for sale. It had only 6 employees in the company, is grossing an average of $300,000 a year. Okay? Last year it milled near 4 million pounds of flour. As you can imagine that. And this was back in the 1970s. No, the 1960s when this was built. I had no idea. Operations of the mill, despite the fact that some of the equipment is 50 to 60 years old, is almost fully automatic. From the time the farmer dumps his wheat into the hopper on the front platform until the flour is ready to be put into bags in the machinery, it's on its own. It was all done just automatically. Now, when you run an operation like that and you're grinding the flour, you're either going to do it with stones or, and this was a big innovation, a gentleman named, let's see, it was Mosley. Mosley and Motley had mills. Mr. Mosley traveled to Switzerland and found out there that they were using an entirely different process to break the corn or the wheat berries up. They were using steel rollers. Wow, what an invention that was. He was the first person to bring that back into the United States and get rolled, we call it about rolled oats and all of that other stuff, to have their wheat ground with rollers. And they built roller stands. And the mill at the Daisy Flour Mill has 5 of those stands, and they would run the wheat through there several times until they got it to the consistency that they wanted it. And so those things are still there. The belts inside have little cups on, attached, riveted to them, that they can take the wheat up or the flour up and to cool it off. See, once it goes through, it becomes quite hot sometimes. And they had something called a roller boy or whatever, that would release some of the heat from all of that early flour before they could put it into bags or into barrels. And of course, barrels were better than if you're going to ship it overseas, you don't want to put it into a burlap sack because of the little mice. So there was a big cooperage industry around here too in Rochester, so that they could ship it out at the time, especially around here. So we had some really very interesting people doing some very interesting things here that made Penfield, put Penfield on the map. And it wasn't really until they got the Erie Canal through and they started doing big things downtown in Rochester at Brown's Race that Penfield kind of got surpassed a little bit in the milling business. When Penfield was so young, it was on the stagecoach ride. And you could get on a stagecoach in Palmyra, go through Penfield, and it wound up in Rochester. That was a good deal. If you wanted mail, it came by horseback. If you were a farmer, all your buddies were farmers. You're probably a member of the Grange. And in society, just like bankers are highly regarded today, millers, the people who were the millers, were some of the cream of the crop. Now, one of the millers' workers was named Stroger. And Mr. Stroger was a rather interesting gentleman. He had a son, Alman. And Alman Stroger became this is a whole aside, okay? Alman Stroger became a teacher. He didn't like the kids, and guess what? The kids didn't like him. So for some reason, we don't know, we think he moved west, maybe to Kansas. Wherever it was, he became a mortician. Wow. Now, you'd think that people would be dying to see him. No. He couldn't imagine what was happening. He knew people were passing away. He wasn't getting any business. And then he found out that the telephone operator who heard about the tragedy shifted all the business to her boyfriend, who was the other mortician. Well, Mr. Stroger said, I will fix that. I will invent the girlless, cutless, weightless telephone, and invented what eventually became the dial telephone. So if your number is 385, 3 times this way, 8 times this way, and 5 more times that way, and you got 385. And so that's right here. Now his brother, Stroger, also invented some electrical devices in Rochester, a battery and some other things. What other things have happened here in Penfield that we should know about? Well, I know this, that we have some trails that take us through history that are really worthwhile going. And would you like to speak to that a little bit? Just tell us about some of the trails.
No, I did want to mention, you had mentioned Lincoln. One of Lincoln's descendants used to live in Fairport, and the TV archives has, I forgot the guy's name, but he talked about his relatives. In fact, I think Andrew is buried in Oakwood Cemetery, but he has a ton of information, and we did the history group did a talk on that, and that was pretty good. The other question I want to ask you a question. Can I? Forget about trail. There's been several people have written about Bill Hosley, and other people have written about the creeks, but if you add up the creeks on Penfield, on the Ronnequoit Creeks, or the mills on the Ronnequoit Creeks, and you add up the mills on Allen's Creek,
yeah.
how many do you think we'd end up with?
I don't know how many.
I don't know. You're the mill expert.
Well, I would say probably at least 30. One of the interesting things about this, and I did write about it, is the millstones that were used by the very first miller in Monroe County. And that, of course, was Indian Allen, who had these millstones carted in during the wintertime with teams of oxen over the ice and snow to bring them here. And that was, just another aside, that was a kind of an interesting thing. Land people wanted to have land beyond the Genesee River. And the Indians, the Iroquois, said, no, that's kind of sacred land, you can't have that. And they said, well, now wait a minute, now think about this. Your poor maidens have to crush those corn and everything in those pestles. Look, what if we give you a mill? Well, okay, you could have a mill, that would be good. And Ebenezer Allen will be the miller. How much property do you think you'll need? Well, from here, from the river, over to a place called Avon. It was the largest mill yard in the world. And it actually happened. You could look at the maps. And that was the deal they made with the Indians. I don't know.
Millstone block of Fairport, is that anything to do with that? Where Hawk used to be?
I'm not sure, but it could have. It's got a great name, the Millstone Block. Today, if you look at the second floor of our county courthouse, they've embedded those original millstones in the wall. And some of them were used in Allen's Creek, and some of them might have been used in Ronnequoit Creek. They went from miller to miller because they didn't wear, well, they wore down, but didn't wear out. And as long as you could keep them sharp, they were very valuable.
They made gunpowder on one of the mills on Allen's Creek.
Yeah, and also
Jeff
in
Vincent talks about
Powder Mills Park, as a matter of fact. And until it blew up. Right, I think it blew up.
Allen's Creek area near the intersection of East and Allen's Creek, where Timothy Allen first settled around 1793. His first building was a sawmill. His next building was a house for his wife, who, much like the first woman you spoke of, didn't think much of this community. And the same fate fell Mr. Allen back in the 1790s as befell everyone else. His house and his sawmill got washed away in the spring freshet, And the good lady said, I don't like the mills, I don't like the mosquitoes, and I don't like the Indians, so get me out of here. And so he took her to Geneva, where he remained for the rest of his life, basically selling off the land. The site of his mill, the Allen Mill, was purchased by Oliver Culver Road, I think you've probably heard the name, and a couple of other gentlemen by the name of Hatch, who then built another sawmill at that location. Almost immediately thereafter, part of the Strouger clan hooked up with a family by the name of Barnes, and they built a mill across from 81 Linden Avenue, where the tall senior citizens home is. And the Barnes Mill was there from about 1823 until 1957, when it was taken for the entranceway to Route 441 off of Route 490. That triple left where you turn off of 490 onto 441 was where the Barnes Mill was located. The Barnes Millstones are currently sitting over the Brighton Highway barn, and they're going to be used in a park at the corner of Kirk and Astor Drive, where the Korean Veterans flagpole is now sitting.
Okay.
Right behind where the firehouse currently is at the corner of East and Elmwood was the location of the Blossom sawmill. And Enos Blossom Jr. and Mr. Barnes were relatives. They both came out of Fairfield, Connecticut through their wives' families. And then the next guy down the line was the Pond Mill, P-O-N-D, from the poet Ezra Pond. His family operated a carding mill right behind 270 Landing Road South, and that burned down because the place was full of wool grease back around 1840. And then the next several mills, which where 490 and 441 are located, and also where Corbett's Glen are located, were the Parsons powder mills. And there was a series of 3 powder mills down there, which had the occasion of blowing up about every 3 years. And unlike the mills that our host has been telling us about, where everything was that you possibly could pack into one building was packed into one building, the powder mills did exactly the opposite. They separated their buildings far apart, built bounds between them, because these mills had the tendency to blow up, and they figured, well, one piece of it will blow up before the other piece does. And that way they kept the mills apart. The other interesting thing that happened in that particular corner is where it's called the Great Embankment, which is the entrance point to where you get into Corbett's Glen. And that particular site, and also the embankment or the railroad overpass at Spring Lake, those are one of the sites that during the Civil War and also during World War I were the site of Army detachments. And those sites were guarded by the Union Army and then the U.S. Army during World War I to prevent the disruption of the railroad in case some saboteur got in there, or terrorist, and knocked the place down.
If I were going to do a saboteur, I'd pick another site. Because the railroad keeps going.
It does, but you break one piece of it, and you're in pretty good
That's right. Well, at any rate, what we've done today is to take a look at what milling was like in Penfield. We've learned a little bit about 3 of the people who were most prominent in that milling, Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Penfield, and Mr. Rich. We found out a little bit about how milling operated, what the mills were like inside. We know that most of the mills were susceptible to fire and flood, and that's why many of them aren't here today. We also have to be happy that we have 1 mill left, which is the Daisy Flour Mill, and now, of course, it's a party house, but if you ever have a chance to get inside and haven't already done it, it's well worth going into. As Mr. Heinrich said, if you turn the switch tomorrow, we probably could run it because they've left it pretty much intact. It is on a national record of register of historic places right here in Penfield. And I don't know of any other place in Penfield that has that distinction. Is there others?
Dayton's Corner School.
Oh, the Dayton Corner School. Okay, all right.
National?
I don't know.
Cinderella's house.
I don't think it's national, is it?
Whatever, but anyway, we have to be proud of the fact the mill is still there. And vandalism didn't, see, for 10 years it stood idle from 1972 until 1982. And it took 10 years to go through all the rigmarole. People said, oh, they're going to be noisy, people are going to be there, they're going to drive their cars by there. We can't have that. We can't have a restaurant there. But eventually, Mr. Heinrich and his pals prevailed. And it was a great restaurant in its day. And some of you may know that when you were there, you got a menu. And the menu came in a bag that looked like this. And if you open it up, you saw the menu inside, and you got prime rib of beef for $9.95. That's not too bad. Atlantic salmon, $12.50. Clams casito, $4.50. Do I have any? Yeah, right. And of course, on the back of the bag, it tells a great deal about Samuel Rich and his mills. But this is what the bags look like. And somewhere here, I think you probably have the original paper or the cloth flour bag that they used. Right. Well, thank you very much for coming. I do appreciate it. I hope you've learned something today. Certainly learned about Rich's Dugway.